So as we begin to look at chapter 14 of your textbook, we're actually going to focus only on the first section, which talks about the ways in which you can write the speech, the different formats you might use. Then we'll come back to this chapter later in the term as we begin to focus on how you actually physically and vocally deliver the speech. So we're focusing on how to write a good speech at this point. So the first rule we're going to look at is that there is no universal technique for giving speeches. That's because there is no universal kind of speech. Some speeches are really long, some speeches have small audiences, some speeches are interactive, some speeches are given without any preparation. So that means that there is no one way to give a good speech. Think of it like this. If I simply asked for you to tell me what a hammer is, depending on your own background, you might give me a lot of different answers. For example, if you're a fan of the comic books and movies, you might think of that as a hammer, and you'd be right. Or if you liked a different kind of movie, like Shawshank Redemption, you might think of this hammer, the very small rock hammer that was used for fine work and chiseling and things like that. Or if you've got carpentry in your background, this is what a hammer is to you. Or there's even another kind of hammer you might use for you want to hit something but you don't want to damage it. Each one of these is a hammer, but each one of them has very specific uses. The same thing is true for how you give different kinds of speeches. So here are the 4 styles I'll be teaching you, and these are exactly the same 4 styles that are presented in the textbook. The first style is called a manuscript. And in a manuscripted speech, the entire speech is scripted and then read to the audience. These are usually for more formal speeches and in some cases longer speeches. Also, you'll notice that legal issues might affect your decision to use this kind of delivery. For example, if you want to be sure that you don't get a single word wrong, you might want to write out the speech in advance. A slightly more professional and crowd-friendly version of that is a memorized speech. Now, some people make the mistake of thinking that a memorized speech is simply any speech in which the speaker didn't look at something while they were speaking. That's not the case. A memorized speech is actually a manuscript that you've loaded into your brain. So you begin with a manuscript, but then you memorize it so the delivery can be performed without having to look at a script or at notes or a teleprompter or something like that. Third, there's the impromptu speech. This is a speech that's given with little or no preparation. The book also calls this winging it, or I like to think of it more as thinking on your feet. These are situations in which maybe you didn't know you were going to be giving a speech, or you knew you were going to be giving a speech but didn't know the content of the speech before the speech began. So these kind of tend to spring up on you. But they're really important speeches. Some of the most important speeches you'll ever give will be impromptu speeches. For example, a job interview is actually a series of little impromptu speeches. So your boss might ask you, where do you see yourself in 5 years? What you're about to give is an impromptu speech, and it better be good. The final kind is called an extemporaneous speech. And this is a speech that is prepared in advance, but instead of using a script, you would use an outline or maybe some keyword notes, maybe even longer briefs that you don't know which ones you're going to pull from in advance, or talking points that you want to be sure you get through. Now, people tend to think of speeches as being these very formal affairs, but I even think of them as much lower level. For example, if I have a problem with my refrigerator and I call the company to ask them about how they're going to fix it, before I get on the phone, I might make myself a set of notes. I might ask them questions about when they're going to be able to repair it, how much it will cost, will there be a new warranty, do I need to be home when the repairman shows up? So in advance, I might make myself a list of notes about the topics I want to be sure to cover, and that'd be the same as an extemporaneous outline. So how do you pick? Well, the answer is kind of in the question. When you look at the question of how you're going to speak in any given situation, the answer is, what's the situation? Because sometimes the situation will dictate for you that you give one of these 4 kinds of speeches. Sometimes you won't have a choice. As your textbook points out, people who speak on the news often speak from a teleprompter. That means the speech is prepared in advance and loaded in. It's a manuscripted speech. And because they have to give a speech every single day, it'd be unlikely for them to spend enough time memorizing those speeches. So instead, they'd stick with a manuscript. Another issue might be in a sales pitch or work in a committee. You might not be able to prepare everything in advance, and you also have to prepare for the possibility that the audience might be interacting with you or asking questions at the end. So memorizing a speech might work for part of it, but not for all of it. So remember, the situation will often give you your first guideline as to how you should adjust the speech. But you also need to think about the obstacles in the given situation. Think about things like how big the audience is, what time of day it is, how much the audience knows, how likely it is that they'll get bored, what kind of technology is available. All of these things would affect the kind of speech that you give. For example, if you've got an audience who doesn't know much about your topic and is easily bored, you probably don't want to read at them the entire time. A manuscripted speech will bore them to tears and will probably confuse them. You might want to instead go for a more interactive, extemporaneous, or impromptu speaking style, just to help engage them. Or, when it comes to technology, you might, for example, hate using microphones. One of the reasons that it bothers me to use a microphone, even in this setting, is that I'm fairly used to moving around while I give my lectures. Because I'm sitting at my desk reading into a microphone, I have to adjust my performance a little bit. You'll also notice that these visuals are a lot more visually pleasing than I normally would use, because so much of what I would normally do would be done by my body and face instead of having to use clip art. Another problem is, what if you need a microphone and there isn't one? That might affect the kind of speech you give as well. Now, instead of all the bad news, you can also think about the opportunities. Some circumstances will actually give you the option to give better speeches than you might not be able to give in other cases. I once taught a class in interpersonal communication that the entire class was set up around tables, which meant the students were all facing each other. Instead of having to force the students to get into groups while we talked about things, they were already in groups. That was a great opportunity. And each table had their own jack for a laptop and their own monitor. So whenever one student in the group found an example of something, they could put it up on the monitor and everybody could see it. That was a great opportunity, so I made sure to use it to the best of my abilities. So the bottom lines are basically these two. Number one, think about what the audience needs. If your speech needs to inform them, then you need to make room for the possibility that the audience might be confused, and that might force you to adjust your delivery style. If the audience is going to be bored, then you might need to adjust your delivery style. All these things should put the audience first. That's my number one concern. Secondly, once you choose a format, make sure to use the format well. And just like the song from the Jungle Book goes, you have to accentuate the positives and eliminate the negatives. So each delivery style has some benefits, and what I'll be grading you on is how well you take full advantage of the benefits of the style you've chosen. For example, we're going to talk about how scripted speeches can have really great language choices in them. But that doesn't mean they're guaranteed to be there unless you put the work in. So make sure to use that manuscripted speech and make great language choices. Similarly, you have to mitigate or eliminate the negatives. You must find ways to minimize the problem areas of each delivery style. So while a manuscript might have great language, it probably doesn't have very good eye contact. So there are some ways you can work around that by practicing the speech, making sure your script is easy to read and large so you don't have to stare at it the entire time. All these things are ways you can minimize the problems of each delivery style. These are the two keys that are the foundation for how you're graded. So for example, in the first informative speech, my main concern is simply that you have the elements of the speech, and I'm not as concerned about the non-vocal or vocal delivery. So use that as one of your standards to answer which delivery style you use. So let's begin by talking about the pros and cons of manuscripted speaking. Now, because you work on the speech well in advance, the first benefit is content, the actual elements that are in the speech. Things like evidence, the arguments, the ideas you want to get across are all well laid out, and because you've done it in advance, you're not being surprised or confused or forget something. Also, you can put those great elements into a perfect order. For example, most persuasive speeches tend to build up to their strongest arguments. So you begin with your first main point, just letting us know about details, and then move on to talk about more and more strong arguments as you go on. And then additionally, you have better style. You can actually pick the best vocabulary. You can find word choices that are more likely to have a powerful punch for the audience, and you will also be more likely to avoid lazy language. And because you've got the entire speech in front of you, you know exactly how long it will be, assuming you've practiced it a couple times and are comfortable reading it. For most people, this speech tends to have the lowest anxiety. That is, because the entire speech is sitting right in front of you before you begin speaking, that tends to get rid of the biggest worry from most first-time speakers. So if you might be worried about your first speech, this might be a good way to go. But keep in mind that there are downsides. The first major con of most manuscripted speeches is that they are not very dynamic. What I mean by that is you can tell when somebody's reading because their vocal patterns tend to get pretty repetitive and they tend to be fairly monotone. They also have bad eye contact, which results in bad audience connection. In short, the emotional value of most speeches that are manuscripted tends to be really watered down because people are reading. Another big problem is if the entire speech is written out word for word, it's not very adaptable, meaning that if the audience gets confused, or if they don't seem to like part of the speech, or if they really like part of the speech and wish you were going to be telling them more of it, the script doesn't allow you to change, so you're kind of stuck with whatever's on the page in front of you. The final problem is my favorite as a teacher. The dog ate my homework. If you show up to give a manuscripted speech and suddenly realize you don't have your script, it's unlikely you're going to be able to wing it to cover for the speech that you were assuming was sitting in your pocket. That's a big problem for this kind of speech. The entire speech exists only on a sheet of paper, which means you could be stuck if you don't have that sheet of paper with you. Now remember, the way I'm going to be grading you is how you take advantage of the positives and handle those negatives. So how can you minimize the harms? Well, first, for the dynamics and audience connection, the best way you can minimize that problem is by practicing the speech. Go ahead and make the script nice and large, just like your textbook tells you. That way when you look up at the audience, you'll be able to focus on us for a little bit and then not be afraid when you look back down to be able to find your spot in the script once again. That tends to cause some anxiety for people. The more you practice the speech, the more comfortable you'll get with the script, and the more likely it is that you'll almost memorize parts of it, and that'll give you a lot more emotion and a lot better audience contact. Now, there's not much we can do about changing the adaptability of a speech, but in really high stakes situations, what some folks will do is they'll have additional pages of the script that they have built in so that if something does happen during the speech, they can suddenly slap in an additional part. That's pretty rare, and I wouldn't worry about it for our speeches in this class. Finally, the best way to handle the dog ate my homework is to be like Batman. Be well prepared. Have that stuff all over the place. Email it to yourself, email it to your friends, print it early, put it in the car the night before, put an extra copy in your pocket, whatever it takes to make sure that you've got that script with you. That's the best way to handle it. One time I had to give a manuscripted speech because the department that I was working for was getting an award. Now, because the award was for the entire department, I wanted to be sure that everybody was cool with the words I was going to say. So I wrote the entire script and had my boss check off on it. Then I emailed it to myself, I emailed it to a friend of mine, I had a copy in my carry-on bag, I had a copy in my pocket, and I had a copy in my luggage. I was guaranteed that I wasn't going to lose that script. Taking those things under account tends to also handle the anxiety issue. You'll get more comfortable because you feel like you've covered every base. So assuming you've written a good script and you've decided to memorize it, now we can have the same benefits of a manuscripted speech. The first several benefits are all the same. If the script was good, you've got good content, good structure, and good style. And, just like with the manuscript, you know exactly how long the speech is. So these are all great. But you get two added benefits. First, you get back the dynamics you lost from reading. If the speech is memorized, it means it is loaded into your head not just in terms of data, but also in terms of emotion. So you can deliver the speech emotionally, just like an actor who memorized his or her lines. They're not repeating them back like a robot. They're actually delivering them with some emotional force. And since there's no script in front of them, they're able to look at the audience as they do so. So these are all the benefits of the memorized speech. But it still keeps one of the cons of the memorized speech, and that is it's not very adaptable. If it's memorized word for word, you kind of have trouble going off script. Now that depends. One of the great benefits of memorizing a speech is you get so comfortable with the topic that you might become a little versatile, meaning that if you have to stop for a second in order to answer a question, it's easy to pick up where you left off. But it's probably still going to be the same speech it was before. You can't make major changes to it. Another problem is it is a lot of work to memorize a speech. Think about it, just mathematically. Take all of the work that you had put into manuscripted speech and now add on the time it takes to memorize it. It's simply going to be more work. That's why it looks so professional. Another downside is, although you don't have to worry about the dogs eating your homework, you still have to worry about your memory having problems. So if you have a memory gap in the middle of the speech, you could be in big trouble. And it's because of that this speaking style tends to cause some speakers to have higher anxiety. It kind of makes them feel like they're walking on a tightrope without a net. If they're memorized, there's no script to rely on. So how do we handle these cons? We minimize these harms in some ways. First of all, when it comes to adaptability, some speakers, because they're so comfortable with the topic, are able to go off script and then come back. For example, Bill Clinton, when he was giving one of his State of the Union speeches, the people who loaded the speech into the teleprompter loaded in the wrong speech. But because he was comfortable with the speech, he was able to go off topic for a little bit in order to cover for the ground before they came back and fixed the speech. Nobody even noticed. The only reason we know it happened was because the script had been released to the public in advance of the speech, and everybody noticed that he wasn't giving the right speech. How do you handle the work? There's really no quick, easy fix here. The only way you can actually bring down this particular negative is by doing lots of these speeches. That means that you'll start to develop easy tricks and mental pathways for memorizing speeches more quickly. But the bad news is it's always going to be a lot of work to do a memorized speech. Now, how can we handle the memory problem? One of the best ways to do this is to memorize your speech in parts. Don't memorize the entire speech from beginning to end. Here's a quick quiz. What is the third to last word of the Pledge of Allegiance? I'll wait. Yeah, if you got to it by now, you finally realize that the word is justice, but you only did it by going from the beginning of the pledge all the way to the end and then winding back a couple words. Think of that. If you had the same problem in a 10-minute speech, we're going to sit there and wait for you to roll through the whole speech in your head. The better way to do it is to memorize elements of the speech in units, so that if you have a memory problem, only one small part of the speech would be affected. That's one of the big benefits there. And by the way, doing that will also help lower your anxiety level, because the more comfortable you feel with the memory, the more likely it is you'll feel comfortable giving the whole speech. Now on to the impromptu speech. The previous two speeches were very polished and clean because they were all planned in advance. The impromptu speech is the opposite. You have no idea what you're going to talk about before it's time to begin speaking. Now, there are plenty of benefits to this delivery style. The first, it's incredibly adaptable. Nothing is more adaptable than a speech that you have never given before. So that means you can adjust to the audience. If they're liking parts of the speech, you can give them more of that. If they seem confused, you can make an adjustment in order to clarify what you were just talking about. It's super adaptable. Also, people usually have a lower expectation of these speeches. They know they put you on the spot. They know you weren't prepared, so they aren't expecting some beautiful oration. They're simply expecting a reasonably intelligent speech. And as long as you meet that low bar, they're usually fairly impressed by it. They're also pretty dynamic. In fact, they usually have a fairly conversational tone. Just regular folks talking tend to be a pretty comfortable way to give this speech. And you usually have good eye contact and audience connection. And let's face it, there's no work involved. All you do is walk into a room and give a speech. There's no preparation involved. So what are the downsides? Well, unless you just happen to know about the topic, you probably have terrible content. I once had to give a speech on Mount St. Helens, which here in Washington and Oregon is actually a pretty common thing for people to know about. But at the time I had to give the speech, I was living in North Dakota. I knew almost nothing about it. I knew it was a volcano, and I knew it went boom. That was the extent of my knowledge. So if you don't have anything in your head about the speech, your content's probably going to suffer. Your structure might also be pretty terrible. My favorite example of this is if you've ever had the unexpected joy of having a little kid try to tell you a joke. What you just heard was probably an incredibly unstructured mess. They started telling you part of the speech, left out another part of the speech, got to the punchline too soon, had to start over again. The speech was just a mess. So an impromptu speech is generally going to be a little unstructured. You might forget things, you might repeat yourself. These kind of problems can happen. Another problem is, unless you have a naturally clear and beautiful speaking choice of words, your style is probably going to be pretty bad. Meaning you're going to use words like stuff and thing, or you'll repeat keywords that you use over and over again. Your style will be pretty low. It's also possible that you might have no idea what to say next, or have to cut the speech short. One of the most uncomfortable things in a job interview is when the speaker asks you a question and your response is to simply say, "Sure," and have no idea how to go after that. Because of that, this speech tends to be one of the highest anxiety speeches. People like knowing things in advance, like having things ironed out before they get up to speak. So how do we minimize these harms? You really can't minimize the content harm other than developing the mental pathways to realize that you know more than you thought you knew. A lot of people don't think that they're that smart, and that's kind of weird because you all have great information in your head. You've all read books and seen movies and heard lectures and read about public events and had experiences that are probably really valuable in impromptu speech, but most people tend to self-censor, thinking, no, that's stupid, I shouldn't say that. It's all about figuring out how to access the stuff that you do know. So the bad news is, one of the only ways to get better at this, other than just getting lucky with the topic being right in your wheelhouse, is by practicing it. Similarly, the best way to get better at the structure is to practice these speeches a few times. This is one of the reasons why most of the students who compete in speech and debate try to do some of the events that have impromptu speaking in them, because it just helps you so much later in life to organize your thoughts while you're put in the spot. Style is also a major issue that can only be addressed by practice. You simply have to get up and give these speeches and begin to trust yourself in choosing words and realizing you're occasionally going to make little minor mistakes. Similarly, once you develop those mental pathways, you'll start getting more comfortable with the idea that you're not going to blank out. You put all of these things together and that lowers your anxiety. But here's the number one benefit I can give you about how to minimize these harms. Remember what I told you about the audience's lowered expectation. Most people are nervous about impromptu speeches because they have far too high of an expectation of the delivery. They think the audience is expecting something magical and amazing, when in fact we're simply expecting sufficient. So don't overwhelm yourself with too much anxiety on an impromptu speech. We know we put you on the spot, so just deliver a speech of the simple and clear ideas that you want to talk about and be done. Well, the good news is we don't have to make any more lists of pros and cons when it comes to extemporaneous speaking, because extemporaneous speaking is the middle of the road in every category. What I mean by that is it's not the worst or the best in any of the concerns we've talked about. For example, if you were to lose your notes for an extemporaneous speech, most of the speech is still in your head. The notes simply were going to help you get from point to point to point. For example, this entire lecture that I've presented to you is an extemporaneous speech. The notes that I'm looking at on my PowerPoint are the only real notes that I have. Everything else is something that I'm just making up as I go. If I didn't have these notes, I could probably still give the speech. But notice that it wouldn't be nearly as good as a script or a memorized speech. Here's another example. It's not going to be as high anxiety as impromptu or memorized, but it won't be as comfortable as a manuscript where every word is looking at you. It'll have better content and style than an impromptu speech, but it won't be as nearly polished as memorized or manuscripted speeches would be, and so on. My strong advice for everybody is that this is a really good place to start if you're unsure about what delivery style to use. Here's why. If you begin with an extemporaneous outline and then you practice giving the speech, you might find that you're already comfortable enough to go ahead and attempt the speech. But if you're not, all you need to do is simply add more meat to the outline and eventually make it into something closer to a manuscripted speech. That would make you more comfortable there as well. The other reason I encourage people to use extemporaneous speaking is that it's the most versatile. It's the one that fits the most occasions. Although impromptu speeches technically can fit every occasion, they're so bad in terms of content that extemporaneous speeches tend to make up for that. So it's a good place to start. Now that we've covered all the delivery styles, you're ready to potentially take quiz number 1. Now remember that the quiz is focused only on this section of chapter 14. We're going to come back to cover the rest of that chapter later and do another quiz on it at that point. I'm also going to post some links for each of the speaking styles so you can see how they look a little different, and there'll be some text along with that to help you spot what I'm pointing out as being the differences between them. Be sure to check with me with any questions you might have before taking the quiz. The quiz is available on Foxtail and is set for only one attempt. That's why I encourage you to ask me the questions before you start taking the quiz, since you won't be able to go back and do it again. So get all your questions ironed out and then take the quiz. Allow yourself plenty of time. The quiz is due by 8 p.m. on June 5th, and it's multiple choice. Focus not only on what these delivery styles are, but also what they're good and bad for. That's it for this round, and you're actually through the first week of the course.